The Trump administration, beginning in January 2025, basically took a wrecking ball to the entire development ecosystem. And the democracy, human rights, and governance infrastructure was probably more damaged than almost anything else.
You're listening to Beyond the Scoop, a podcast from Harriman Magazine at Columbia University's Harriman Institute for Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies. I'm Harriman Magazine editor Masha Udentsova-Brenner, and that was Sarah Mendelson.
I'm currently a distinguished service professor of public policy at Carnegie Mellon University, and I direct something called Sustainable Futures.
Mendelson is an alumna of the Harriman Institute, and I profiled her for the latest issue of Harriman Magazine. She's worked in the field of international human rights and democracy promotion for more than 30 years, starting in Moscow during the mid-90s and including posts in the Obama administration.
Leading USAID's democracy, human rights, and governance work worldwide, and then as U.S. ambassador to the Economic and Social Council at the UN.
With the Trump administration's destruction of basically all U.S. human rights and democracy promotion abroad, Mendelson has watched the dismantling of much of what she's worked on throughout her career. But the problems in the field of international human rights and democracy promotion started long before the Trump administration, she says. The profile that we published about you is called In Search of New Approaches to Human Rights, and I'm wondering if you could distill for our listeners what was wrong with some of the old ones.
Well, it's not to displace the international legal frameworks that are in place, but the way in which, at least in the Euro-Atlantic context, that the human rights work and the human rights framework evolved was really a product of the US-Soviet dynamic and the Helsinki Accords.
The Helsinki Accords focused on political freedoms.
Freedom from detention, torture, freedom of religion. And so in the US, for example, we typically really downplayed the socioeconomic side of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I remember sitting in the third committee at the UN, and everybody around me, all the other countries, wanted to pass resolutions about the right to water, the right to food.
But the U.S. government, says Mendelson, didn't perceive those things as part of the same framework. Take healthcare, for instance.
It's well known that in the United States we pay more for health, but we are well down below other high-income countries in terms of health outcomes. And that is in part because we regard health as a commodity as opposed to a right.
So Mendelson and her colleagues, academics both within and outside the United States, started deliberating how to change the U.S. approach to human rights.
A lot of us who had worked internationally all our lives began to feel that the way in which the U.S. was thinking and talking about human rights was way off, and it didn't reflect the kinds of inequities and inequalities that were happening in this country and that were affecting democracy in the United States.
While the U.S. has typically perceived itself as a showcase for global human rights, the inequality within the country is so great that living standards for some are on par with those in much less affluent countries.
I live in Washington, D.C. I live in Ward 3. The life expectancy for Black men in Ward 8, another part of Washington, D.C., is less than that of a man in Bangladesh, a country that the World Bank classifies as developing. So within different demographic groups, particularly in the United States, we are experiencing life as we know it in very, very different ways.
Mendelson and her colleagues started realizing that the U.S. approach to human rights and democracy promotion had to change.
So we began to have a conversation about things like the gaps in life expectancy or the high rates of food insecurity in the nation's capital, nearly 25% of children living in poverty, that all of this needed to be viewed as a human right. The kind of way in which we would talk about the United States doesn't really line up with the experience that a lot of Americans have. And it made that sort of traditional democracy promotion around the world, to my mind and a number of colleagues, much more problematic.
Mendelson wrote about these conversations several years ago for the Brookings Institution. Can the United States, she asked, continue to support democracy and human rights around the world while racial inequality at home is more evident than at any time in recent history? The answer, Mendelson wrote, was yes, but only if we turn inward first and reimagine what development looks like.
I am part of a growing cohort that I call the closer to home movement, where experts who've worked internationally all our lives turning to the US to try and understand what's happening. We're at a moment where we really need to be focused on saving whatever's left of our democracy here.
Mendelson says that the closer to home movement really came together around 2017, just as she was leaving her post at the United Nations. 2 years earlier, the UN had adopted the Global Sustainable Development Goals, which Mendelson called a 21st century way of looking at development. Mendelson was leading America's global human rights and governance work when these goals were being developed.
There was a 3-year conversation around the world, really 2012 to 2015, about what would a 21st century development agenda look like. And out of that, and a lot of negotiation and millions of people weighing in, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals were developed. A framework that is not only about reducing poverty and increasing well-being and health and gender equality, but reducing inequality, increasing rule of law and anti-corruption. I mean, it's very broad.
The goals also include things like climate issues, environmental protection.
It addresses a whole host of issues that the development community previously had really wrestled with, or they thought that democracy, human rights, and governance work is somehow separate.
Mendelson, who graduated from Columbia with a doctorate in political science in 1993, began her career in human rights and democracy promotion at the Democratic Institute for International Affairs in Moscow in 1994, where she advised emerging liberal political parties on how to use focus groups to engage with citizens. This was an optimistic period in Russian politics, and yet she witnessed foreshadowing of the problems to come.
You'd have multiple liberal candidates running against one another in, say, St. Petersburg, and guess what? The LDPR or Communist Party deputy wins because the libs are just completely competing against one another.
Too many liberal candidates led to fragmentation and a lack of coordination within the pro-democracy movement, and that led to many lost elections for the liberals. Mendelson warns that U.S. Democrats should pay attention to that lesson today.
We just had a special election in New Jersey and J11. There were like 11 candidates running to get the Democratic spot for the special election that will happen in April. And just looking at it, I thought, this feels a lot like a movie I've seen before. And if we do that, obviously I'm a Democrat, if we do that in all sorts of races, that's not helpful.
And there's another lesson Mendelson highlights from her work, one that she says underscores the need for new approaches to human rights. This lesson first became apparent to her in the early aughts, while she was working for the Russia and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, also known as CSIS.
I had written the first grant for a human rights organization, Memorial, that came from USAID, and CSIS was a sub on that grant.
The goal was to support Memorial in organizing focus groups and surveys that would help them hear from and respond to local populations.
In this case, we were looking at how did Russians think about the second war in Chechnya. The human rights activists, for the most part, wanted to talk about the military human rights abuse. But in focus groups and in large random sample surveys, we found that the vast majority were interested in how much the war cost and the number of casualties.
Watching this unfold, Mendelson wondered who these human rights activists were actually listening to. The people on the ground, Russians, or their donors in Washington and Geneva. She noticed this pattern recurring throughout her career in global human rights and democracy promotion. While working for USAID, she saw Congress setting the human rights agenda without hearing from the people it was trying to help. What were their needs and concerns?
95% of the funding for democracy, human rights, and governance was earmarked by Congress. We had a supply side, congressionally allocated approach as opposed to a demand driven, what are the local populations thinking about?
Mendelson warns that she's watching these patterns play out in U.S. domestic politics as well.
The candidates need to be listening to really what the voters are anxious about, which is it's the economy. It's really bread and butter. And there are too many times where Democratic candidates haven't really focused on that. I think talking about democracy in the abstract is actually not helpful to people. They need to tie it to the fact that if they have a family member who has cancer or some other serious illness, it can bankrupt them, cost of food, housing. The people are feeling quite gloomy about their future.
Mendelson believes the work she's doing with the Sustainable Futures Initiative at Carnegie Mellon can help put politicians in closer touch with their constituents. In a pilot program in Pittsburgh, the Sustainable Futures Initiative is using AI to gather data that can identify a community's most pressing local concerns.
We're trying to reimagine development. We're literally trying to figure out how can we harness small bespoke AI tools to help listen and respond to what local populations are thinking.
The program works closely with NGOs and other local organizations.
An example would be the wait for maternal mortality data is years long. And in some cases, the state of Georgia has stopped collecting any of it. But if you're in a community where you have a lot of faith-based groups or NGOs working with, say, Black women who are hearing all the time about what's going on, then there's the opportunity to gather that in a way that protects identity, but also to work with local government in a timely way to be able to respond.
Mendelson says that the disconnect between local communities and those representing them has a lot to do with shaping our current political climate.
When people talk about democracy and the faults, the focus tends to be on things like civic education or elections and voting. But I think part of what's going on is democracy is not delivering the kind of livelihoods and life experience that Americans a generation ago expected.
If the pilot program in Pittsburgh works out, Mendelson hopes to implement the same model in other U.S. cities and perhaps eventually in other countries around the world.
The United States is not the only democracy that is not delivering. And we think that it does have potential for helping rebuild development. There's a real need for resilient local models to be developed, particularly with the evisceration of foreign assistance. And it's not just the United States. European countries are all increasing their spending on defense. And they've really cut their overseas development assistance.
Reflecting on the arc of her career, Mendelson recalls the heydays of working in U.S. human rights and democracy promotion.
There was a kind of genuinely euphoria in the late 80s and early 90s. I remember distinctly, was on a fellowship at Cornell thinking, this is quite an amazing time to be an American, notwithstanding whatever inequalities were happening in this country, but feeling like there was a model, there was something to offer. And so the arc of this, it's not a good story. It's a very sad story.
Is there something hopeful that you can leave us with?
Look, a lot of democracy lives locally. And so there are pockets of places in the United States that have been really engaged with the Sustainable Development Goals, including in Pittsburgh. And I think that they offer a recipe for getting it right. I think there is a framework that can help us get through this, but I worry that things could get worse before they get better.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Scoop, a podcast from Harriman Magazine at Columbia University. I'm Masha Udensova-Brenner. This episode was written and produced by me and edited by Ann Cooper. If you like what you heard, please leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice. Until next time.